Let's make sure this is all sounding good. And once I'm clear on that, we'll get going. Okay. How we doing over here? Let's take a look over here just to make sure everything is okay. Let's take a look. Okay, I think we're okay. I think it's good. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. I am indeed somehow, magically, I am Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and this is yet another episode of UnShrink Me. So welcome everyone to this week's podcast, and I hope that everything that you hear and see today is useful and entertaining, perhaps. So we'll see how useful and entertaining it actually is. But if you are brand new, UnShrink Me is a weekly podcast that is dedicated to you, the consumers of mental health services. So this is a podcast that is about critiquing, exploring, challenging ideas that are popular in clinical psychology, psychiatry, mental health, more broadly speaking. And what I like to do every Saturday is to find popular posts and discuss them, the ways in which they're relevant and not relevant to consumers of mental health services, and share my opinion. So this is, again, my opinion as Patrick Lockwood. Even though I am a licensed clinical psychologist here in the state of California, this podcast is just my opinion as a regular person. And so I will try to share from what I believe is my relevant experience. However, my relevant experience is not the only experience out there. So feel free to cancel me if you like, but please don't sue me. And this is probably one of my favorite things I get to talk about this week. So we have a lot of interesting topics this week. And I want to talk about, in particular this week, the problems of less than healthy therapists and counselors and coaches and all these kinds of people. I have a couple of posts from Twitter that I'll be reading and exploring and discussing. And for everyone who's here in the chat, please feel free to chime in and share whatever you believe is true. I'm just going to share this live stream real quick on Twitter, and then we will get going. So without just a little bit more delay, we're almost there. So give me just a sec, and then we'll get into the post from today. If you are brand new to this podcast or brand new to me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is at Alobha Patrick. That's ALOBHA PATRICK at Alobha Patrick. Okay, just one more second. Here we go. Just about to share it. Very good. And so we're shared. And so hopefully more people will join the stream and we'll get this thing up and running. So welcome everyone. Today's podcast, I want to talk about a few different things. Specifically, I want to talk about what to do with therapists that are less than healthy. I also want to talk about what it means to be reactive or not as a professional. And for many people who consume therapy, counseling, coaching, psychiatry, etc., you've noticed that your professional has various reactions. And so you might be off-put by that or have questions about that. So I'd like to discuss that a little bit. And I want to talk about intuition, and I want to talk about CBT. And so I'm going to start this week's podcast with a very quick discussion of CBT. And the reason I want to start this podcast with CBT is because, as always, there are people online who misunderstand what therapy is and is not. And so let me start by retweeting Dr. James Davies, who's been on this podcast before, or who has at least been referenced on this podcast before. He's never been a guest. So let me retweet his post. Okie dokie. This is my softball, get us started before we get into the scandalous post thing. So here's what Dr. Davies, Dr. James Davies, PhD, said. And his handle, if you want to follow him, is at JDAVIES PhD on Twitter. So here's what he said 2 days ago. He said, AI therapy isn't neutral. It's mostly informed by a CBT ideology, focusing on what individuals can do to change themselves and better fit their environment, rather than encouraging critical scrutiny of the social conditions harming them. It's an agent for spreading neoliberal norms. And so what I will say about this rant of his, I guess, is it's probably true. He's probably factually correct when he says that a lot of people using AI and related kinds of apps for therapy are using components of CBT, aka cognitive behavioral therapy. And the second thing he says, CBT ideology is quote unquote focused on what individuals can do to change themselves and better fit their environment, rather than encouraging critical scrutiny of the social conditions harming them. So I have a lot to say about this particular phrase because this is in the kind of political nonsense category of things that I think professionals in my industry should have nothing to say about. So it's definitely the truth, 100% the truth, that all of us are entitled to political opinions of whatever kind. And if you want to have very strong feelings about politics, you're welcome to make your life worse. If you're a conservative and you want to have lots of strong feelings about politics, feel free to ruin your state of mind with your feelings about politics. If you're a liberal person and you have strong feelings about politics, feel free to ruin your life by caring so much about politics. Whatever your politics, I just don't care whatsoever. However, when professionals talk about their specific beliefs about so-called neoliberal norms or whatever it is, I start to take issue with that because, number one, it's not our training and our discipline. Who gives a shit what we think about it? We are not trained scholars in anything political, number one. Number two, also, who cares what we think? Like, you should never, literally never care what I think, in my opinion, about politics because I'm allowed to have my own unique individual opinions or my non-unique individual opinions about politics because my life has shaped me, blah, 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 blah. And so what I would say is that who cares what Dr. Davies thinks about neoliberal beliefs or things like that? But beyond even that, let me talk to this important point. So for those of you who are out there and you're seeking therapy or counseling or coaching or whatever it is, right? I want you to understand very, very clearly that this idea of changing yourself to better fit your environment versus critiquing social conditions is bullshit. It's not a dichotomy. It's not like a quality professional will just randomly only try to make you modify your life so you fit better in your environment. That's just not how therapy works. If you have specific thoughts and feelings about the environment you find yourself in or the social conditions you find yourself struggling with, an ethical clinician would be allowing you the space to talk about that and examine the relationship you have to broader society and politics and all of that stuff. So an ethical professional would certainly be allowing you space to talk about your problems with society. They wouldn't be trying to make you just accept and never have feelings about your place in society, whether it's for social justice reasons, diversity, or whatever reasons. It doesn't matter, in my opinion. If you want to have feelings as my patient about those conditions of society, you're more than welcome to. It is certainly your choice to have feelings about these things, and I would never want to try and convince you away from your feelings about these things. What I would be interested in, by the way, is how helpful it is for you to be that distraught about things. Because having feelings versus being destroyed by the political nonsense of the day are two very different experiences psychologically. It's entirely different to have a reaction to something versus to let your life melt all the way down because Trump said this, or Biden said that, or Obama believes this, or the House just did this, or the Supreme Court just did that. I can't imagine that it's actually all that adaptive to find yourself in emotional or psychological rubble every time a politician does something retarded, because they do that all the time, by the way. So I think my question would be for Dr. Davies is that, is there some middle ground between, being a slave and a mindless zombie in society that hurts you versus being a reactionary all the time to the insanity of life? Because life is rather absurd no matter what society you live in. And if you live in the United States or parts of Europe, there's a really good chance you live in a relatively free and functional world where you're probably not going to die tomorrow. There's a really good chance. So I think there's a question of perspective taking, to use a CBT skill, about like, how bad is it really for you? And what do you want to do about your social conditions? And how worthwhile is it for you to be in tatters at all times because some random person with a red or a blue tie that has no real bearing on your life, unfortunately, that we can't really influence? Like, how useful is it to be reactive to that stuff? As a clinician, I want you to have freedom to react as much as you want. And then my only question will be, how useful is it for you, all things considered, in your life, because it is your life, not mine, right? So I'm not going to ever convince my patients to live like me, because they shouldn't, because my life is mine. I am uniquely different than them. So I would always ask people, when it comes to the so-called neoliberal norms or whatever bullshit he's on about, I'd be very curious, like, how useful is it really to be in tatters every time a politician does something stupid or your government does something stupid, which they do all day, every day? So I guess the question for me, Dr. Davies, is it worse to figure out how to accept circumstances that are absurd? Or is it better to whine and complain and fall apart emotionally at all times? Because those seem to be the dichotomies you're offering people. I think most ethical therapists of whatever political background certainly want you to feel free to question the conditions of your existence, because the conditions of our existence are rather absurd in every country on the planet. And so life is absurd. If you've read Camus and all this stuff, life is absurd. So for me, Dr. Davies, I think I would love for people to understand, and I'm not even a CBT person, but I would just love for them to understand how their cognitive errors are serving them or not. And that's a question that they get to answer, not that I get to authoritatively tell them, as it were. So for me, that's my thoughts on Dr. Davies' tweets. I hope that makes sense. I'd love to hear any and all criticism and feedback about that. Because like, good therapists or even AI therapists don't want you to be a mindless drone, I think, in society. So that's just me, for whatever it's worth. So let's talk about a post that I made about a week and a half ago, real quick. So this is under the heading of, what do you do with sick therapists? Most state licensing boards have specific laws about what to do if you are unwell as a professional. So let me retweet one of my posts from a few weeks ago, just real quick. So the preamble before I talk about the post I just retweeted. It's very important that everyone understand what I said 2 podcasts ago, where I talked about my personality style, what I believe is true about me, and how healthy I am and all this stuff. There is no perfection in being a person. No professional, no psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, LMFT, LPCC, counselor, coach, guru, or whatever, who is self-actualized perfectly and has it all handled and their life is amazing. Most people in the profession are just regular people. Some of us are sicker than others. Some of us are more disordered, personality disordered than others. Some of us are in recovery, not myself, but other people. Some of us are more neurodivergent or whatever it is. There are all sorts of different flavors of mental health and quote unquote helping professionals. But the thing that I want to be very, very clear about is that most states have very crystal clear laws about the fact that if you are acutely struggling and it's interfering with your ability to do your work, it is your job to either seek out remediation for that problem, whether it's something like you need therapy or rehab or whatever, or to voluntarily suspend your license for some period of time, or to completely surrender it if you can no longer function in your role. That's true in California and most jurisdictions. So, with all of that I just said in mind, here's the post, and here are my thoughts on how to handle sick therapists. And I'll say what I mean by that. So here's what I said on May 4th. Many, if not most, therapists have never had ongoing peace of mind. They have not learned how to have a more open and non-judgmental relationship with their minds. Their own neuroses or lack of a more mindful relationship with their inner world keeps them in constant conflict. So guess what they expect is normal for you, the patient, aka constant conflict. Also, many therapists have ongoing issues with their parents or spouses, not worked through, lacking in acceptance. So resentment and conflict drive them. So I said two different but related things. The first thing I said was the vast majority of mental health professionals of whatever kind are accustomed to ongoing conflict because they've never experienced ongoing peace of mind. So I could certainly smuggle in lots of different things with a very vague phrase, ongoing peace of mind, so allow me to be very specific. And again, I am not saying that I have achieved nirvana or something, so let's be very clear about what I am trying to say and what I am not trying to say, and how special I think I am. So if I tell you that most therapists do not have ongoing peace of mind, what I mean by that is most professionals that call themselves doctor or counselor or therapist or whatever have a variety of unresolved conflicts, as most people do. But I would argue that therapists in particular, or healers or whatever, have a special set of unresolved issues that make them very interested in continuing to be healers, which I've talked about on other podcasts. So what I believe is true about most professionals is that it is their baggage of sorts that drives them to continue to stick around for the profession. It is not that they have some brilliant and beautiful, loving, altruistic, I want to help the world thing. That's a silly stereotype. Most people in the profession have various types of baggage that drive them to continue to help people. Some of it has to do with their family of origin. Some of it has to do with their personality differences or neurodivergences or whatever. But they do not have inner peace. Now, what do I mean by ongoing peace of mind specifically? What I mean is the ability to notice their inner world without judgment and without attachment to what they just noticed. So I'm talking about two very simple Buddhist principles that everybody and their brother can practice. You can practice being aware on purpose without judgment, and you can practice being aware and not attaching to the thing you were just aware of. And so practicing non-judgment and non-attachment can make you more mindful, to use a buzzword. So what I'm saying is most therapists are not very mindful people. They're people who are, I would say, rather reactive. And there's nothing wrong with that because that makes you a regular person. But what I'm saying is these people that you are entrusting with your minds and your lives are probably not the most well people who probably don't have a lot of internal peace of mind. And that should concern you. It should concern you that their internal world has relatively little peace. Now, what I am not saying, just so that people can, understand my position clearly, is I am not saying that in order to be an ethical and helpful professional, you have to be some kind of Buddhist monk who is constantly at all times at peace. I am not operating in black and white thinking in this moment. I am trying to operate in a relatively nuanced way. That if your professional is ethical and is aware of their stuff enough, they will do what they can to be as mindful as possible while they are sitting across from you in their professional role. What they do outside of that is up to them. However, ethically speaking, our job really is to be as present as possible so we can have the most helpful and ethical relationship possible. So I would be willing to say that most professionals in the industry are not very ethical and they don't have a good handle on their stuff. Notice I'm not saying they should perfectly resolve their stuff and be perfect. I'm saying nothing of the sort. That's not a reasonable standard. As the APA ethics code says, what would a reasonable professional do? So what I'm saying is you should be somewhat skeptical of how unhealthy your professional is. Number one. Number two, this ongoing peace of mind thing is not rocket science, and it's also not a big ask. As a clinical supervisor, I have had many conversations with my interns to be more aware of their reactions and their judgments. And their lives and their practices have not gotten worse because of it, by the way. So being more mindfully aware, more non-judgmental and non-attached is not calling for callousness and coldness and apathy and disdain or something like that. What I'm calling for is the capacity for professionals to get a handle on their shit and understand that perhaps they're not as mindful and aware and integrated as they say they are. And so if you are a consumer of mental health services and you notice that your professional has lots of strong reactions, it might be worth asking them why they probably aren't taking care of themselves. What's going on with you? It would be so fun and wild to watch patients ask their therapist if they are okay, the therapist. Not that the patient should have to do that ever. But if you're an ethical and quote unquote healthy enough therapist, as Edmund just said here in the chat, thank you for being here, Edmund. Your therapist should never wonder. And your patient should never even be remotely curious how you're doing. Right? It should never be the case that a patient is concerned about how you are doing. That's absurd. Because therapy is not about you, the professional. Therapy is about the patient. It's a professional relationship. And so you owe it to yourselves and your patients to get your shit together and learn how to be more mindfully present and non-judgmentally aware and non-attached. Everybody wins. Your family wins. Your friends win. Your spouse or significant other wins. Your patients win. Your colleagues win. Everybody wins if you can be more present. So again, to summarize, I am not saying your therapist has to be perfect to help you. I'm not saying they have to be a Buddhist monk or have achieved nirvana or something like that. I am saying that the vast majority of people in the profession are rather unwell, number one. Number two, they have a lack of ongoing inner peace. Number three, this can be achieved very straightforwardly, though not easily, by practicing attitudes and learning how to practice attitudes like non-judgment and non-attachment. Freud talked about this over 100 years ago, the concept of evenly hovering attention. It's impossible to have evenly hovering attention if you're busy with your own feelings and judgments as a professional. So, if you're a patient, feel free to use your voice, I would say. If you're a family member of a professional you're concerned about, feel free to use your voice. Empowering people to use their voice, I think, is a good idea, especially if you don't trust your professional. In fact, talking about the distrust you have for your professional can strengthen the therapeutic relationship if it's handled appropriately by the professional, because it's their job to handle it appropriately, by the way. It's not the patient's job. So, I hope that all makes sense. I really hope that all makes sense. Thank you for being here, Edmund. Okay. By the way, this podcast today is not, N-O-T, not brought to you by Monster. A little different. Actual sugar. Let's have a bit of a Okay. So someone recently said, this is a bit of a palate cleanser before I move on to my other post for today. Um, but before I get to this palate cleanser post, let me get to the comment here. Tax-centric says, makes sense. I tried bringing something else to my therapist, but he deflected with let's focus on you. Well, again, this is not specific advice to you. I heard what you said, or at least I read what you just said. And, in any ethical therapy relationship, the main goal is to have a productive conversation about how the relationship is going and then talk about techniques and coping skills and all these things. And so the relationship is the most important thing in therapy. And so tax-centric, whatever you need to strengthen your relationship or have a better relationship with your therapist, I hope you get it. And sometimes therapists deflect, to be honest. In fact, I would say one of my favorite things that I see happen online, especially when I post something quasi-controversial, which I don't think is controversial, is a lot of deflection or refocusing on me for some reason, which is always fun. It's that Uno reverse card that professionals do when they feel uncertain or under the gun, so to speak. So I hope you get what you need, tax-centric. All right. This next post is from someone. You're welcome. This next post is from someone that has interacted with me recently on Twitter. Excuse me. And I guess his handle is the Trauma Guy, and his full handle on Twitter is at TraumaInformD, not ED. So anyways, let me just retweet this real quick because he asked me specific questions and I told him I would address this on my podcast. Okay. So back on the 30th of May, the Trauma Guy asked me some two comments or questions. What are your mechanisms of change? Specifically, what do you aim to change in a session? Breathing patterns for anxiety, any dangers? So let me talk about number 2 first before I talk about mechanisms of change in number 1. So there are many different breathing techniques that therapists, clinicians, counselors, psychiatrists, coaches, whatever can recommend for you. I think the 3 most common types of breathing that's recommended include diaphragmatic breathing, which is different than box breathing, which is different than, I would say, mindful meditation breathing, like mindfulness. So those 3 are probably the more common recommended breathing approaches. I think, to the best of my knowledge, diaphragmatic breathing has the best efficacy for stress and anxiety in the literature of the breathing techniques, to my knowledge. So when managing anxiety, Trauma Guy, if you're listening, or if you see this at some point, really you want to choose a breathing technique based upon the type of psychological and physical struggle you're experiencing. So for some people, a lot of their anxiety and worry is based upon this cognitive appraisal that their life feels out of control. And so if they feel and they think that their life is out of control, which is fine, helplessness and all that is very common for people with anxiety and trauma, you might actually help people learn something like box breathing, because box breathing is less about calming the central nervous system and more about teaching you how to feel in control through distressing, controlled circumstances. Whereas diaphragmatic breathing is much more directly about calming you down, if that basic discrepancy works. So depending upon what your goal is and what the problem is as you conceptualize it, you might recommend different types of breathing. Second layer to this is some types of breathing are harder for people to do if they have medical conditions, lung issues, breathing issues. And so you should always be very mindful of what kinds of co-occurring problems the person has. So just to name a very simple, for instance, if you are a victim of sexual assault, then diaphragmatic breathing might be rather triggering for you, because if you're fully expanding your diaphragm, that is regionally very close to areas that you might have been assaulted. So if you have physical trauma, sexual trauma, things like that, diaphragmatic breathing might make you more dysregulated, even though diaphragmatic breathing is, by all measures, probably the more effective type of calming your central nervous system skill, coping skill, it's definitely tricky for people who've been sexually traumatized. So I think you should be very careful and thoughtful and strategic about how you make certain recommendations for certain skills, which is what good clinicians, coaches, counselors, psychiatrists do, is we try to take into consideration all the variables that might make certain skills more or less helpful for a person. Now, to your first question, which is far more complicated in some ways, but also extremely simple in other ways. So he asked, this is his first question. He asked, what are your mechanisms of change? Specifically, what do you aim to change in a session? So the answer to that question is very complicated in many ways, because I have worked with all sorts of different types of people. I've worked with families and couples and individuals. I work with people whose primary problem is addiction or trauma or personality disorders. And so depending upon the presenting problem and depending upon the person's level of insight and intrinsic motivation and all these things, I will focus on what is A, their goal, and B, they're actually willing and capable to do, right? So in some sense, it's very simple in the sense of like, I have to assess and formulate a case conceptualization of them. I also have to ask them with full respect and humility, what do they want to do? What are they willing to do? How do they understand change? And how are they interested in changing, if at all? Because sometimes people are not interested in changing, which means I'm not here to do anything. Literally, I'm here to sit with someone and support them until change becomes something they're interested in, right? So it really depends upon where the person's at, not to weasel out of the question. Now, one thing I'm very interested in for most people who are interested in changing is managing what the ACT, acceptance and commitment therapists call experiential avoidance. So the vast majority of people with trauma, anxiety, depression, personality issues, and things like that all suffer from a problem of pathological avoidance. All human beings struggle to be here and now, to be present in their present existence psychologically, because being fully immersed in the present is fraught with feelings and judgments and concerns and baggage and trauma and shame and all these things for the vast majority of people. And then for patients, people with actual mental health problems, they experience usually far more distress and impairment because of the chaos in their minds, because of the present moment distress and uncertainty and things like that. So generally speaking, Mr. Trauma Guy, whoever you are, whatever your name actually is, I think one of the core things I'm interested in as a professional is helping people learn how to have a better relationship with the reflex of avoidance. Now, analysts and people like that think of defense mechanisms and see those defense mechanisms as solutions to present moment distress. And so whatever your type of therapy modality, most types of therapy are helping people with the core problem of pathological avoidance. Now, here's the deal. I'm using the phrase very specifically, which is pathological avoidance. Not all avoidance is pathological, because it's not a human standard to be fully present at all times in all circumstances and situations. It's just impossible. So if we're going to be rational and compassionate, people are not going to be perfectly mindfully present in their day-to-day lives at all times. They're going to have distractions. Like right now, my very adorable cat Willow just walked by, and I'm sure there are dozens of reasons why I wanted to check out from this conversation I'm having with you all live right now. And I can be aware of that and probably do better next time. But the point is, that's a perfect example of how checking out ever so temporarily is part of everyone's existence. And so the spectrum of avoidance, let's call it that, ranges from mostly adaptive to mostly maladaptive, right? So pathological or mostly maladaptive avoidance is one of the things I focus on, regardless of your diagnosis, your culture, your gender, or your background. Because pathological avoidance is what keeps most people sick and stuck in their patterns that aren't helping them. So I hope that made sense, Trauma Guy. Okay. Sorry it took me so long to answer your question. You were very nice to ask me a question directly about one of my other episodes, so thank you for asking. Let's get to today's main event. I have a lot of stuff I want to talk about, so I'm scrolling real quick. I apologize. Okay. So, to go back to the topic from earlier, here's what I said about a day ago. Okay, so I'm going to retweet this real quick, then I'll talk. And if you're brand new to me and new to this podcast, my handle on Twitter is at Alobha Patrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. So, a day ago, a colleague was posting about this screenshot. So I'm going to describe the screenshot, not my colleague's post. So this screenshot, I believe, is a joke, just to be clear. So, excuse me, I don't believe that I'm misunderstanding this. So here's the joke screenshot. Yesterday is what it said. Yesterday I explained something so bleak to my therapist, she asked me if we could pause for a minute so she could think about it. I'm getting close to winning therapy. I can feel it in my bones. So the joke is like, if we're trying to win therapy as a joke, then it's like you beat your therapist if you can stump them, shock them, things like that. Now, I took that seriously as opposed to jokingly. And here's what I said about a day ago. I said, and I quote, healthier therapists would not need a minute. If you don't have your personal stuff handled or you're naive, you will be shocked or surprised by things patients say. Nothing, I mean nothing, should be shocking or surprising if you are competent and healthier. So people, understandably, had some problems with that. Lots of comments and replies. And I'm not here to get into the specifics or shit talk a particular person or something like that, although that could be fun. Well, here's what I'm going to say. And this ties in with my earlier point about what to do with unhealthy therapists. Bring it up to the relationship. Bring it up to your therapist. If something feels wrong, tell them. Use your voice. You're paying for this time. Use your voice. So, just to recap what I said, healthier therapists would never be shocked or surprised by something a patient says. Now, this might sound inhuman and unreasonable. Let me explain what I think is reasonable. And this is what I do as a clinical supervisor. This is what I do when I'm training people as a professor and as a supervisor. And so far, I haven't been fired, and people seem to like me as a professor and a supervisor, so who knows? I think people will also accuse me of this rhetorical trick called a Mott and Bailey, where I take a softer position. Well, I'm going to go hard on this position. So, in keeping with what I said earlier on the podcast, ethical therapists, people who care about their license because they want to do the right thing and cause as little unnecessary harm as possible in the relationship. So let me say that again very slowly. Professionals who care about their license and want to cause as little unnecessary harm as possible will do their best to practice attitudes like mindful awareness, non-judgment, and non-attachment. Ethical professionals who care about their license and causing as little unnecessary harm as possible will practice attitudes like non-judgment and non-attachment. So, I did not say to be even minimally helpful, you have to be perfectly neutral and unbiased and unreactive. That's not what I said. That's not what I said or implied. I also said that you are allowed to be a regular person and have reactions and to even cause harm as a therapist. I'm going to say that again very slowly so I can be quoted or cut and canceled. Therapists are allowed to cause harm to their patients by being regular people and having reactions and not being perfect. However, ethically speaking, we should do everything in our power as professionals to practice attitudes like non-judgment and non-attachment so that whatever our baggage is and whatever our unresolved stuff is, it does not bleed into the relationship and cause unnecessary harm. There's a difference between necessary and unavoidable harm, which happens in all medical services, and avoidable harm. There is no healing art at all. There's zero healing arts that cause zero damage to people. All healing arts cause damage to their patients. Surgery, psychiatry, therapy, counseling, coaching, Tony Robbins, every last kind of coach, guru, therapist, doctor causes harm to their patients. Our job, ethically speaking, is to be as mindful and aware and open and curious and receptive as possible. Edmund says, when is a confront needed? A confrontation? Can you be more specific with your question? Are you saying confronting a patient, confronting a therapist? What are you talking about? So to go back to this while you answer my question to your question, it's important for professionals, for therapists, counselors, coaches, psychiatrists to be perfectly clear that we are not harmless professionals. We are harmful professionals. And ethically speaking, it is our job to produce as literally, minimally unnecessary harm as possible. But distress and harm happens in all therapy, in all counseling, coaching, psychiatry, surgery, medicine, etc. So our job is to do everything in our power, ethically speaking, to have as little negative impact that's unnecessary as possible. Which means you probably shouldn't be surprised if your patient says something drastic or weird or, per your morals, evil or whatever it is. If you really are practicing non-judgment and non-attachment, there's a really good chance you're not going to have a reaction to something absurd, ridiculous, scary, shocking, surprising. It's okay to have a reaction. I didn't say you're going to have zero reaction, because that's not the point of mindfulness. The point of mindfulness is to notice the reaction and then have a more skillful, etc. reaction after you notice that reaction, to create distance between what you notice and what you do, which is what we're called to do as professionals. So Edmund says, when do you confront a client? I almost never confront people. So I was trained to use something called motivational interviewing. So in MI, you're not being confrontational. Confrontational implies that you're correct and they're incorrect, or they're lying and you're telling the truth. When in reality, if we're talking about motivational interviewing, what we do is we do this thing called highlighting discrepancies. So when I believe someone is either lying to me or is acting not in alignment with their stated values and goals, they're in a discrepancy between what they say and what they're doing. So my job from the point of view of MI specifically is to highlight that discrepancy and be curious about it, not to be confrontational. I am not adversarial. Believe it or not, you'd be shocked. I am not a confrontational, adversarial person as a professional. I'm certainly adversarial online and on this podcast, but I am absolutely not adversarial as a professional. And the reason's very simple. It doesn't help. So the best MI combination that I've ever seen work in my life is this 1-2 punch of asking for permission and highlighting the discrepancy with full curiosity and no judgment. So you called it, Edmund, pointing out an incongruence, but it's not pointing out, it's being curious about. The attitude has to be curious. If the attitude is not curious, then it's your narcissism and your ego and your fear and your anger or your frustration, whatever your feelings are as a professional, that's you and that's your problem, which you should leave out of the room, right? So if you're using motivational interviewing correctly, you can be evocative and have feelings and stuff like that. However, you should also be radically curious and open. So help me understand. That's the preamble I use with people. You start with asking for permission. Hey, I just heard you say this, and I'm very curious. Would it be okay if I asked you about something I think is curious? So you ask for permission, and then you highlight the discrepancy. You said this last week in session, and today, however, you did this last week. Can you help me understand what's going on there? I really want to understand. Very curious, like genuinely. Not, I gotcha, not Columbo, if you're old enough to know that reference. Even though in MI it's jokingly called Columbo sometimes. So for me, being genuinely curious, withholding my judgment, noticing it and pushing it to the side and all these things, being mindfully non-attached. Because if I'm attached to the outcome, if I highlight this discrepancy and I'm attached to an outcome, then therapy is about me, not about you. So every time therapy is about me, that's a problem. And that's what I'm saying in this post. Therapists like having reactions. Therapists like drama. Many therapists love a good story. And they want to be part of the patient's story. They're excited to be like part of the internal lives of their patients. And I just don't care. And it doesn't make any sense to me that that's the thing you focus on specifically. So I think it's very selfish when therapists have very strong reactions to what their patients are doing, because it's about you being part of their story and the story in your head, as opposed to being more focused on what the patient needs. So for me, I think you should not be shocked and surprised if you're an ethical and competent professional. You can certainly have the reaction internally, but expressing it is absurd, in my opinion. It's just my opinion. So Edmund, did that answer your question? So being mindfully aware, non-judgmentally aware, non-attached should allow you, especially if you know what your baggage is, should allow you to not be surprised and not be shocked if someone says something outlandish or whatever in your session. You're allowed to have that judgment. I'm not saying you won't. It's like I have all sorts of internal experiences when people are talking with me, but I don't let them dictate what I do. I do everything in my power to not let them dictate what I do. I'm not perfect. Never said I was. Not a robot, etc. It's just not worth it, and it's always about me when I let my reaction drive things. Yeah. So where the fun starts is what you just said. He said, then to watch the reaction might be where the fun starts. Yeah, but I don't want to watch the reaction, if that's what you're talking about. Like getting a reaction out of somebody, provoking, is part of MI to some degree, but you're trying to do it with curiosity and respect, not with the goal of enjoying what you're doing, which is where I have a problem with most therapists. Most therapists are interested in having a good time with their patients, which is fundamentally selfish, by the way, because it's about what you want as the professional, not about what the patient needs. So that, I think, is worth everyone considering. So I'd like to end today's podcast with a tweet from Franny Fanny, who I've talked about before on this podcast, and I think she's awesome. That's my judgment. I'm not going to get into all of this because there's a lot that she wrote, and she's a rather verbose person online sometimes. But I think it's worth everyone seeing and thinking about, in my opinion. That's why I'm bringing it up. Her handle, Franny Fanny's handle on Twitter is at proud_Penelope, Penelope. Okay. Here's what she said a couple of days ago. Yeah, 2 days ago. So it's a 3-part post, and I'm only going to stick with number 1 because of limited time, and I think it's complicated, and we don't have a lot of time here, but I think it's worth reading. So follow her, follow proud_Penelope if you're interested in all things mental health and therapy, etc. So here's what she said, and I quote, "Intuitiveness is an underrated skill in life and therapy. I found most people admire intuitive capacities, but once in a while you will come across a type, usually an obsessive, who cannot see the forest through the trees in his own life, and balks at the idea that others may have a gift or skill set that he doesn't. In parentheses, pattern recognition, subconscious processing of information, observational skills, and read subtle cues, and will always ask others for logical or explicit evidence of their intuitions from a place of curiosity, but from envy and dullness. I cannot stress enough how much you should ignore these types when they do this." So here's what I will say about this, because she's saying something I think very important. So if you're out there and you have any illusions about what therapy is, I would like to be very clear with you that therapy is not super complicated in many ways. It's wildly complicated in other ways, but some of the ways in which therapy is very simple is, number 1, it's a relationship, but it's a professional relationship, which means there are specific goals, ethics, and standards that we have to apply to our professional relationship. So that's number 1. Number 2, another very simple thing about therapy for everyone to understand is what Franny just said, which is we all have something called intuition. This is not a very scientific word, unfortunately. I wish it were more well-defined or better researched, but it's not. But your intuition, your gut reaction, can be very helpful in therapy and in life. And it's important to be very clear that it can be very helpful. And using it and honing that intuition is a big part of what good therapists do when they're in supervision or consultation, which is something I enjoy doing as a professional. Because honing intuition helps me and the person I'm helping as a supervisor. So I agree with you, Franny Fanny, that intuition is a very useful skill. Now, here's what I will tell you to side with the obsessives, as she said, real quick, is that intuition is highly biased. Highly, extremely, exceedingly biased. And to be very crystal clear about it, it can be very dangerous because your intuition, my intuition, is honed by my experiences. So my life and my experiences are, in many cases, nothing like other people's lives and experiences. So to apply my intuition, or even my empathy, as it were, to other people is absurd. This is one of the things I think I dislike about the concept of empathy in therapy, is it's mostly projection and fantasy. People are assuming that their inner life can be adequately and accurately applied to the mental models of other people's inner lives, when in reality that's not literally possible. And so no matter how similar you are to your patient, your empathy and your intuition might be very helpful. It might be a clue. It might be a hypothesis. But applying it literally or rigidly as if it's real or important or factual is a problem. So the major disagreement I have with you, Franny Fanny, is the idea that your intuition should be trusted so much that you shouldn't examine it. And what I would argue is that every intuition you have, every moment of intuition that you're conscious of, should be cross-examined like a really good litigator. because your intuition is about you first, not about the patient, just to be clear. And so being radically clear about your gut reaction is extremely important if you're an ethical clinician, as opposed to just randomly applying your so-called intuition with people. Now, it gets muddier because now how are we supposed to be in a mindful, non-judgmental flow state if you're radically analyzing your intuitions like a lawyer? That's a lot of work, right? Sometimes we can only do that post hoc after the session, which means you might have harmed somebody with your intuition, which means you need to come back and repair something the next time you see them, etc. So on the one hand, I certainly agree, Franny. Intuition is awesome and useful and can make you sensitive and a good radar for certain topics, especially that you have a lot of experience with. But the problem is your intuition is built on your personality, your baggage, your culture, all this stuff, which means that it's highly biased and sensitive to things that make you alert and aware, not that makes the patient alert and aware, if that makes sense. So it's about you, and being clear about the fact that it's about you and could potentially be not very helpful as a hypothesis is the problem I have. So for what it's worth, read her entire post. I think it's well done. I think she has a good point. I also think it's kind of that typical psychoanalyst, like, intuition's good. It's like, it's all right. It's sort of useful, but it's also not, it's not completely useful in my opinion. So that's what I would say. So I think that's all I've got for today. And I just want to say this one last thing as a general point for anyone watching and listening, or who watches and listens after the fact, especially if you're on Twitter and you interact with me or you lurk about me. I want everyone to understand that this podcast is my thoughts. And so I am different. I have a previous podcast 2 episodes ago, which I think is 65, where I explained at length the ways in which I believe I'm different. And so if you disagree with me, feel free. I have no problem with that. Edmund says, if they go into a cognitive dissonance or altered state, hints at more. Yeah, exactly. The reaction they have to how we highlight discrepancies tells us about where they're at. Absolutely, for sure. Hey, Darren, glad you're here. It's okay that you missed it. Rewatch it if you want. So I'm making this general point here. So here's the deal. Here's the real deal. Because I am built differently, and I acknowledge this, I understand that my opinions might seem radical to some of you. I try to explain things as simply and straightforwardly and reasonably as I can. I also try to acknowledge the things that I say that are radical, comparatively speaking. Because a lot of people, especially more normie kinds of people, are not ready to give up their addiction to their judgments or their feelings. A lot of people really like their emotional reactions. And I wouldn't say this lightly, but I think there's a great deal of narcissism in the average therapist that they don't recognize, because they really enjoy the emotional experience of feeling special and getting something out of being with their patient and helping them and being a hero for them or whatever. And God bless. I understand it because I like attention too. I just try to do it in a way that's less selfish and more pro-social. That's it. And to me, because that's how I see things, and I'm aware of what I want and what I don't want and what I think is helpful and not helpful, that means that people aren't going to like it. Because most people don't like awareness. They don't especially like self-awareness. If you look at the people that are the most popular gurus, they're people who are pseudo-self-aware, right? If you look at the people online, on Instagram, on YouTube, etc., the people that are the most popular usually are the people that are pseudo-self-aware. It's people that can speak little phrases, brief insights about how they're built or what matters to them, but not go all the way and tell the whole truth. And that's something that everyone should be aware of. The people that can have limited transparency are the people you should trust the least because they're usually selling something. Whereas people like myself, and I know I'm not the only one, can say in full detail all the things that I'm selling, all the things that I think, all the things that are wrong with me, and be open to learning more. And that is what differentiates someone like me from many of the gurus online on YouTube. And then there's other people who just hide behind so-called professionalism. And I think those people are cowards. And I don't appreciate or respect cowardice because life is short, number one. But number two, we are not called upon by our ethics code or professionalism to be cowards. We are called upon to have the most authentic and ethical relationship possible. So if you're hiding behind professionalism, you are technically doing your patient a disservice. So finding the correct balance of being a real person within the confines of professional ethics is the challenge, is the art of psychotherapy, counseling, coaching, and all those things. And so what I encourage everyone to consider if you are seeking out a mental health professional of some kind, of whatever degree and license, is that balance of how real are they? How ethical are they? Are they clear about informed consent and how complex informed consent is? Are they clear about their stuff? Are they willing to own their stuff? Can they own when they did something wrong? Or is your therapist always good? If you have a therapist that's always good, I'd be kind of sus about that, as the kids say. Seems sus. Maybe your therapist likes to be idealized, which is kind of scary. So anyways, just some shower thoughts to end today's podcast. I really appreciate all of you being here, Darren and Edmund and Tax-Centric, etc. Thank you for showing up and contributing and sharing and all this. And I hope that something you heard today was interesting, worth considering, or helpful. And since we're out of time, I don't have time for a joke. I'll try to have something funny for you next week. I look forward to seeing you all next Saturday. This is UnShrink Me, a weekly podcast on my YouTube channel, The Psychology Checkup. You can find me on YouTube and on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at alobhapatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. Come chat, have fun, challenge me, whatever's fun. Let's do it. Let's go. And I'll see you all next week. Please take extra good care of yourselves, eat good food, get enough exercise, get enough sleep, and have fun in your relationships. Life is short. You deserve to have a good time.